Hi, welcome to the install video for our 3rd gen Tacoma high clearance front skid plate and Crossmember delete. We're going to get started with showing you guys what parts come in the kit. So first up we have the high clearance skid plate, the replacement Crossmember, and then the oil change access cover plates for the skid, a couple of large square washers, the hardware kit, and power steering relocation kit. So the first thing we're going to do here is install our Rock Runner badge onto the front upper right corner of the skid plate here. So we're going to take these little 2.5mm screws, install them through the logo, and then right into these laser cut holes in the skid plate there. So on the back we're going to put just a regular flat washer, then the lock washer, and the stainless nut on there. Now these are obviously very small hardware to get that attached. You're going to use a 1.5mm Allen key on the front and then a 5mm socket for the nut on the back to tighten these down. So the next thing we need to get started with here is removing the OE power steering cooler that comes on the Tacoma. It sits down too low and it's in the way of the high clearance skid plate. So we're going to replace it with this aftermarket power steering cooler kit. And in order to do that, of course, you need to have your front bumper and front skids and everything removed from the truck to get in there and get this replaced. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that. All right, so this is the original power steering cooler that we're going to be removing right here. To begin with, there's 2 bolts that hold it in place that thread into this cross member, one here and one back here behind this metal bracket. So you want to remove those so this is loose and disconnected. So we're going to be taking that out completely along with this rubber hose that attaches to it and the other rubber hose that goes up to the power steering reservoir up there. So first thing here, we need to take this hose clamp off, pull this rubber line off of the steel one, and then we're going to let all the power steering fluid drain out into a drain pan. All right, so you can see that our lines are pretty much all drained out. They've stopped. This one's still dripping a bit there. You could put a plug on it if you want to, or just let it continue to drain. There's also one more metal clip up here in the fender well. This one right here has to be, there's a bolt there you need to remove so that this whole line is loose. And then moving up from there, this line that follows all the way up to the power steering reservoir up there, that one needs to be removed from the reservoir next, and we'll show you that from the top view. Okay, so we've moved up into the top of the engine bay here, and this is the hose that we need to remove from the reservoir. It's the front one, and it's also the smaller one. This return line is much bigger. We don't want to mess with that one at all, so we'll just move this hose clamp back and pull this line. Okay, so once that hose is removed from the reservoir, now everything should be disconnected and we can pull that entire steel power steering cooler with all the rubber hoses that we disconnected out from the truck. We will not be reusing any of those pieces. So you can set those aside or throw them away. We will no longer need them. So we have our OE power steering cooler and the hoses and everything all out of the way. So we're going to get ready to put in the new cooler here. We're going to show you what comes in the kit. So in the box you'll find the replacement cooler. There's going to be a short length of hose and a longer piece of hose there. Every kit has a barb fitting in it, although you will not need it for the Tacoma. That's just how all of our kits are put together for the other vehicles we use them for. Then there's going to be some hose clamps and mounting pins for the cooler. So one thing we're going to do once we get started, this long piece of hose, we're going to cut about 4 inches or so off of it. Doesn't have to be exact. And then we're going to actually slice that hose open the long way so that we can use it as edge protection on the inner structure of the vehicle, so when we route our power steering hoses, it doesn't cut get cut on the steel in there. So we're just going to take a piece of that and carefully slice it open the long way here, like that. So then we can go and install it on the truck. All right, so we're over on the passenger side of the engine compartment in here, and right where this air conditioning condenser line goes through, we want to put our piece of rubber hose on the steel right there. So we're going to open it up where we sliced the hose, and then put the open side facing down so that we can get it to just kind of fit around that sheet metal right there. And that's going to offer some protection for when we run our new power steering hoses through here so that they don't get cut rubbing against the steel. So we're going to start with the shorter piece of hose first, and we're going to connect that one to the power steering reservoir up here in the engine bay. Now I put a little bit of power steering fluid in the end of the hose here just to help it slide onto the reservoir easier. So that we're going to push that one all the way on, and then grab one of our hose clamps and put that on the hose too. Then we'll want to take this hose and route it through the inner structure, right through that opening where we put the rubber protector on there. So we went ahead and removed the grill from the front of the truck just to give us easier access to go ahead and install the cooler. So we have our reservoir hose here that we ran through already. Now we want this cooler is going to be, we want it to end up being positioned right about in this spot here. That makes it fairly easier for positioning to get the mounting pins through and access from the back of the fan there. So with it sitting there, we need to cut a little bit of length off of this hose so that it's not too long. So we're just going to hold it, and that's about where we want to cut it right there. That should be the correct length for us. And then we can put a hose clamp on our hose and then attach the hose to the top of the cooler here. All right, so now we're going to take the longer section of hose and we're going to feed it through this same opening that we put the last one in, going from the top here, and then go around the back, and we just want to pull it straight down the back here and follow this other line that's already mounted, and we're just going to run this one over and connect it to this bottom line that we disconnected earlier. So I'm going to make sure I put a hose clamp on first, and we'll go ahead and slide this one on. All right, we've got it on there far enough to get the hose clamp tightened down, and we can go ahead and tighten that one right now. All right, so this hose we just put on, we want to make sure we pull up on it to get rid of any slack so that it fits nicely against this other hose here, and then we'll put some cable ties on there to secure that later. And now back up top here, we're going to feed this one behind the AC condenser line there, and then we want to hold our cooler back up approximately where it's going to set, and then again mark our hose and cut it to length. So now we're going to put our hose clamp on and then get our lower hose attached to the cooler. So we got the hose pushed all the way on. We can go ahead and tighten down this hose clamp right here. At this point you can actually go and double check all of your clamps, make sure they're tight and they are all fully installed. One thing to note, before we get this attached to the condenser, you'll want to take a look at these clamps here, and if you need to adjust them, you might want to loosen it a little bit. Like this one I need to rotate back just so that the clamp isn't rubbing into the condenser after it's mounted, so you want to check that too. Okay, so we're getting ready to mount this cooler right to our condenser and radiator there. So you're going to use these plastic mounting pins that go through the fins. We're going to push it through one of these holes that's right on the frame, the side of the cooler here. And then we want to take these provided little foam pads here, peel the sticky back off so it can stick to the cooler. Slide one of those on. And we're going to do that on both sides here. All right, so when you're going to mount these, make sure that these pins are sticking through the backside, just a small amount. These are meant to be able to snap and break them off on the backside after you get it all attached. So be careful with them that you don't bend them and break them before they go through. So really, all you need to do is just line up this cooler about where you want it to sit, and then you're just gonna push these little pins through gently. They're going to find a spot to go through in between the ribs and the condenser and the radiator back there. So you just want to feed them through real slowly like that. All right, so next thing we need to do, now that these pins are just pushing through the radiator on the other side, we need to put the other connecting piece on the back of that rod. So these little pointy pieces go towards the radiator in the back there. So I'm going to reach down from the back here through the fan, and then you want to make sure if that pin is sticking out a long ways behind the radiator, you want to pull it back through so there's just a little bit to get the other end started with. Like I said, these do snap off really easily because they're made to do that. So get the back side started, kind of hold that washer in place on the back there, and then start to feed this plastic pin all the way through. All right, so we want to push on this cooler a little bit and on that connecting washer on the back there until it's snug. It's going to have a little movement to it, that's fine. And you don't want to push extremely tight because, again, we do have condenser and radiator. We're going through both, and we don't want to like squeeze them together too much. So once those are snug, then you just bend those on the back side. Just bend them like that and they'll just snap right off. And those will be out of the way so your fan doesn't hit them. Okay, now that our cooler is all mounted, hose clamps are all tight. You want to go through and double check those, make sure they're tight. None of them are rubbing on the condenser or anything like that. Just again, for clarity, just to mention, make sure this top line goes to the power steering reservoir. We want that one on the top because as the system bleeds, air will make its way up into the top line and out the reservoir. So now we're ready to refill the system, and we're going to just fill up the reservoir, and then we're going to get in the vehicle without starting the engine and start to turn the steering wheel back and forth to get that fluid to start working its way down into the system. So it helps to have the vehicle off the ground or on jack stands or something so you can easily turn the wheel. Okay, so we finished up with our power steering cooler install. We just manually turn the wheels for a while to get some of that fluid to work its way down in the system and the air to come out. Once the reservoir stays full after doing that, then you can start the vehicle and turn the wheels back and forth a bit more to get more of that fluid cycled in there. And then just do a final check on your fluid level, and that whole installation for the power steering cooler portion is done. So next up, we're going to prepare to get our crossmember removed from the vehicle. So first thing we got to do there is take these two bolts out here, 12mm socket. You want to remove those and then just kind of let these steel lines hang back out of the way. So next thing we're going to do here, just to get ready to cut this crossmember off, we have a measurement going from the bottom of the crossmember up to the top of that tape there. We measured up to 4 1/8 inches, and that's going to give you a reference mark of where to cut across the top of this tape. And then I just kind of followed that tape around the corner just above this hole right here and wrapped around the back. So you'll want to cut along the top of that tape line all the way around. So I'm going to mark the other side, and then we'll be ready to get started with cutting. Okay, so we have both sides all marked out here with arrows pointing to the top of the tape so we know which side of the tape to cut on. I'm going to use a 4.5 inch angle grinder to cut the cross member out. However, if you're not experienced with one of these, they can be pretty dangerous if you don't know how to use them properly. So a Sawzall with a long enough blade to cut all the way through would also be a good choice to get this portion cut out of here. So a couple things to watch for. It's typically easier to start on the inside first because that area is harder to cut. So get in there and cut that first, and then the easier part last on the outside. And then once you get right towards the end of cutting, the frame might want to move a little bit, so it could bind up your blade. So just be aware of that once you get towards the end of the cutting. So I've got the cross member just about ready to come off. I wasn't quite able to reach all the way around the corner with the grinder, but it's enough that I can just wiggle it here and get it to break off. Okay, so obviously one of the most important things to watch out for when you're cutting is to not cut too high, because we don't want to be cutting into our main frame rail here. So the next thing to do, now that that cross member is completely out of the way, we're going to get a sanding disc or a grinding wheel, whichever you prefer, and just sand this material up just a little higher until it's flush with the bottom of the frame rail here and it's nice and square. So that's what we're going to do next on both sides. The frame is now all cleaned up real nice on the bottom side here. I just used a flat sanding disc, sanded everything flush so it's nice and smooth with the bottom of the frame rail here. Did that on both sides. And as you're sanding off the bottom of the frame here and cleaning up these welds, you want to make sure that you bevel this one piece of steel here that's left on the frame. That's going to make room, just clearance for this weld that's on our cross member that we need to put up in there. So you want to make sure that those are beveled on both sides. Now we just need to go ahead and spray some black paint on there so everything is sealed up. And once that dries, then we can proceed with the rest of the install. Next thing we need to do here to get ready to bolt our high clearance cross member in is have to take these plastic plugs out of the frame. So there's one on each side on the outside like that, and then there's one on the inside that needs to be removed as well. I'm just going to put my screwdriver through from this side and pop out the interior one. So make sure you get those on each side of the frame rail. So we're ready to go ahead and put our high clearance cross member in between the frame rails here. So when you lift this up into position, we want to put these two little small tabs facing the back of the truck, and then these bolt flanges facing up. So that's going to slide right up here in between the frame, and you want to make sure you pull it forward as far as you can until it kind of hits the back of these little stud pieces here, and then center it equally so you have like an equal space on each side. Now I have a couple of clamps that I had ready to go that I'm going to use just to hold that cross member in place. If you don't have clamps, you know, if your truck is on the shop floor or something, you know, you could use a floor jack or something like that just to lift this up and hold it into position. Now we're going to prep these 1/2 inch flat washers real quick. There's 2 of them on each side that we need to slide down in between the frame and that cross member we just put in there, just as a sort of a spacer. The easiest way to do that, just take a piece of masking tape, stack the washers together, and then we tape right to itself to hold the washers together and to have something to hold on to so you can drop them down in place. For our next step here, we need to take our 1/2 by 3.5 bolt with a grade 8 flat washer. We need to get ready, have this ready to go from the outside of the frame here. I'm just going to set it off to the side for a moment, and we need to drop our cross member just a little bit so we can slip these 2 washers down in between the cross member and the frame here. It can be a little bit tight sometimes. This one's actually pretty close to dropping in, but if it won't go, you can drop the cross member just a little bit, and that will give you enough room between this flange here and our cross member to easily drop the washers in position. So if you need to do that, go ahead. I'm going to slide these right down in here and then grab my bolt from the outside. I'm looking through the hole here to make sure I can line up the washers, and then we're going to go ahead and get this 1/2-inch bolt threaded into this nut that's welded into the cross member. So don't tighten that down all the way yet, just thread it in a bit, and then you'll want to do the same thing over on the other side. Now that we have our 1/2-inch bolts started with our washers in place, we're just going to make sure we double check again that this cross member is up tight against the bottom of the frame and it's pulled forward as far as it can go. And I just clamped it back in position. Now I'm going to start tightening these 1/2-inch bolts just to get a little bit of pressure on the frame and the cross member so that I can then remove these clamps and the cross member will stay in place. However, you don't need to tighten these all the way down yet, just enough pressure on them to hold this in place. So I'm going to continue tightening these 1/2-inch bolts. I'm just going to do one side here. We want the hole on the cross member to line up with this hole that already exists in the bottom of the frame rail. So I'm going to tighten it just enough to get one side to line up so that we can put that lower bolt in. All right, so that hole lines up nicely now. So what we're going to do next, I'm going to take our 3/8 by 1 bolt, grade 8 bolt with 3/8 grade 8 flat washer, put that in from the bottom of the frame here. And then we want to put grade 8 flat washer on top. This is a little tricky reaching inside there and dropping it on the bolt, but we want to get that on, and then we're going to do our 3/8 flange nut next. That one is definitely tricky, but once you get it started on your bolt, then you can thread that in, and then we'll move on to the other side there. So I found out that it actually works pretty good to roll up a piece of masking tape here, just because it is about impossible to try to put 2 fingers in there to hold that nut in place. You can just put it right in here, drop it in position, and then turn your bolt with a socket or by hand and get that nut started on there. That works really well. So now I'm back over to the other side of the cross member here. I'm going to continue tightening this 1/2-inch bolt until our lower hole lines up, and then we can put this bolt in the bottom. Now that we have both of our lower 3/8 bolts in the holes and the nuts in place, we're going to go ahead and tighten this hardware down. These grade 8 bolts, we're going to tighten those. They can go up to 35, 40 foot-pounds is fine for those. I'm going to tighten them down with this 3/8 impact. So an impact driver does make it a little easier because you can't really get a wrench inside this hole to hold the nut. But those nuts are flange nuts with kind of have serrated edges on them, so they should grab the washer and stay in place for you, even if you're using a wrench. But an impact gun does make it a little bit easier. So for our just final tightening of the hardware on this cross member, we need to snug up these 1/2-inch bolts on the outside. Now we recommend using a torque wrench and going to about 60 foot-pounds. because if you over tighten these, it will start to crush in the side of the frame. So we set them at 60, and that's what we recommend for those. So then all your hardware is tightened up for the cross member. Next, we're going to go ahead and get these cooler lines mounted to the back of the cross member here. All right, underneath here we have our transmission cooler lines, these steel lines here that were attached to the original cross member. We just need to move those up and attach them to these tabs that are located on the new cross member. So it's going to go up above that cross member tab, and we had to loosen this bolt just to make this clamp adjustable a little bit so it would line up fine with these holes here. So once you have those in place, then we're going to use the 1/4 by 3/4 button head bolt with flat washer and put those up from the bottom here, and then on top you'll have another flat washer and the nylock nut. So we're going to use the same hardware for this other mount as well, the 1/4 inch button head with flat washer. Another flat washer on top, and our nylock nut. Now once you get all that hardware in there, you can go ahead and tighten those down, and then you'll want to make sure you retighten this clamp here if you did have to loosen it. And then it doesn't hurt just to double check, since we are moving that back and up, make sure that your hoses have plenty of clearance and that they're not rubbing on anything that could damage them. Okay, so we have our cross member installation all finished up. Just want to check for a couple things again. Make sure your hoses aren't rubbing on anything. Our power steering cooler lines from earlier, when we swapped out the power steering cooler, we threw a couple cable ties on those hoses just so they're not loose in the engine compartment. Next, you can go ahead and put your grill back in, put your bumper on, everything you need to do up there. Sway bar and remote resi brackets, all that stuff is easier to put on now before putting on the new high clearance skid plate. So you want to get all that stuff reassembled, and next we're going to put on the new high clearance skid plate. So we're about ready to install our new high clearance front skid plate here. One thing to note, because that skid does come up at such a higher angle than normal, if you do have a diff drop on your Tacoma, you may have to clearance this front diff bracket and the washers just a little bit with a grinder, sand it at an angle, otherwise that skid plate might push and pinch against it. So you just have to sand that a little bit to make some clearance there, and then you'll be ready to go ahead and get the skid plate put up in position. All right, so now we've got a couple helpers. We're going to grab the skid plate and lift it up into position. They're going to hold it in place for me, and I'm going to get the first bolt started. So first I'm going to be using these 8mm bolts, the gold flange bolts with a 3/8 flat washer on them. So they're going to position the skid approximately where it needs to go, and then I'm going to go ahead and start these in these center holes here. Can't see anything up there. All right, so getting those two threaded in partially will be enough to hold the skid plate in position up here, and then we're going to go ahead and get our other hardware started. So the next ones we need to put up in the very front here into our new high clearance cross member. We have a 3/8 by 1 grade 8 bolt with 3/8 flat washer and then a 1/2 inch flat washer on top of that. So we're going to go ahead and get those threaded into the front here, into the cross member. So next thing we need to do is get these carriage bolts started up through the cross member in the back here. So we're going to take these 3/8 by 3.5 carriage bolts, and they're going to go up through this slotted hole in the bottom of the skid, and there's some large diameter holes in the cross member. So this is going to feed through those, and then we're going to put this big square washer on top of the cross member so that the other hardware doesn't pull through the big hole. And then we're going to put 3/8 inch flat washer and then the 3/8 flange nut on top. So it's kind of hard to see in there for the video, but that's the process that this needs to go together. So we've got these two 3/8 by 3.5 carriage bolts here, just loosely installed up through the cross member there. Now if you have a mid skid as well, go ahead and put in all of your carriage bolts across here that join the two skids together. Just loosely install those. And then you're going to want to slide the skid plate forward as far as it can go with its adjustment. If you have a diff drop, that just gives a little bit more clearance between the skid and those differential brackets there. So slide the skid forward, and then you can go ahead and tighten down all of your hardware to secure the skid plate in place. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do to finish up our skid plate install is just put our oil drain and access covers on. So the smaller square one goes in the back here using these 1/4 by 3/4 button head bolts. We're going to go ahead and get those installed. So after you've got your cover plates installed, you just want to go through, probably double check that all your hardware is tightened down. Make sure you didn't miss any of the ones on top of the cross members or anything in the back. And once all that is finished up, you have completed the install of your cross member delete and high clearance skid plate.